3 to 4. Just to repeat, from 2 to 3, we will be presenting on updates to the MEPA greenhouse gas policy. And then from 3 to 4, we'll be presenting on the updates to the climate change adaptation and resiliency policy. Okay, so moving forward, next slide, please. In terms of greenhouse gas, as some of you may know, the existing protocol at MEPA was issued in 2010, and it's called the MEPA Greenhouse Gas Emissions Protocol and Policy. There were portions of this presentation were presented 2 years ago at an advisory committee meeting in June of 2022, but there are some new components in this proposal as well. And this is what we're calling a straw proposal. So we don't have full language out for comment. This is a conceptual proposal that you'll be hearing about today, but we are taking comments through September 16th. And the main components are what's listed: stationary sources, land alteration, mobile sources, and social cost of carbon. Next slide. So just a quick preview of the MEPA program. It's modeled on the Federal or National Environmental Policy Act. So the federal program, of course, is premised on federal actions, and state MEPA is triggered based on state actions, some municipal as well, but primarily state actions. So when there is a state action or approval required, a project must undergo a comprehensive environmental review before obtaining permits, and exploring project alternatives and involving members of the public in review of the project are the critical components of the MEPA review. And so, and more relevant for the discussion today, in 2008, there were statutory changes that now require the MEPA process to consider the effects of climate change. Next slide. So as I indicated earlier, the GHG policy was put into effect in 2010, and some of the key components that are in operation now first relate to stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. This primarily relates to new building construction and energy use. Mobile sources relative to traffic, new traffic generated by the project. The policy also references potential additional sources, and most notably, unusually large amount of forest or land clearing. And currently, the policy indicates over 50 acres is the trigger when the policy requirements apply. And as with most other protocols, the GHG policy applies to so-called EIR projects. Those are projects required to prepare the environmental impact report. And among other things, the policy requires what's called a GHG self-certification to be filed when the project is ready for implementation, usually before building permits are obtained. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to jump now to the stationary source component. As I said, it primarily relates to new building construction, and the Department of Energy Resources is here to present on this piece in terms of the policy updates here. So I'll turn it over to Paul Ormond.
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Can we give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Terrific. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Ormond. I work for the Department of Energy Resources. We are the State Energy Office. One of our roles here at the DOER is to review MEPA projects with respect to building GHG. You can go to the next slide. We're gonna skip these few slides that are just kind of overviews of the GHG process that you're familiar with. To the next slide. You can go to the next slide. Next slide. We'll start here. So we're proposing 3 updates to our MEPA GHG policy. The first update is to propose a simplified MEPA opt-out process for projects that are committing to best practices. So in that decision tree here, this is the choice that goes along the top of that decision tree. So if a project comes into MEPA for particular buildings, if they're proposing to build those buildings to GHG best practices that we identify, then the project does not have to do any modeling or evaluations. It would be taken as a given that that building meets GHG reduction goals. So this is meant to help encourage projects or buildings to undertake them with best practices, to simplify the process for everyone involved, and to also make it clear what we think best practices are. So that would be, it's very clear to say that this is something that is completely optional, and a project could do this as little or as much as it like. So for example, if your project had 4 buildings, one of them could choose the opt-out like this, and then the other 3 could decide not to choose the opt-out. Or you could have all of them choose the opt-out or none of them choose the opt-out. So if you don't choose the opt-out that we're proposing to create, then the process that you go through is just like what you go through today. So that wouldn't really be any change. That process would be, show us what you're proposing to do, demonstrate what the GHG emissions are under that alternative, compare and contrast, like this process that we have now. The one change that we would make in that choice is that we would ask you to evaluate as part of your choices our list of best practices. So that we would ask you to analyze that as one of the alternatives. And then we could compare and contrast what you're proposing to our best practice alternatives. So it gives some structure to what we're expecting to see for evaluations and hopefully simplifies the process. And if the project you think is amenable to the best practices, I think it simplifies the process considerably. In all cases, we're also proposing as part of this update to create a kind of standard report card so that it would propose the particulars of how to report what you're proposing to do in your building. So that way it's more standardization, et cetera, to make the process easier and simpler. At the end of giving the 3 updates, I'll give an update on the particular best practices that we're considering. So just hold a thought on what those particulars are for the moment. Let's go to the next slide. And you can skip this slide because we'll go over a more detailed version of that. So the update number 2 is that we would propose to revise how mitigation commitments are expressed. So the way that we did this, 14 years ago or so now, is that the commitment for GHG reduction was expressed as a % GHG reduction from a base case, which was tied to building code. And we just think that that's a very out-of-date way to approach or think about mitigation in the context of buildings. And that's because building decarbonization there's more dimensions to it than just % reduction of that nature. So for example, we would propose to change the % better to a list or standards that you propose to build the building to. So these standards are those bullets that you see at the bottom of the slide. So it would be, how your building is proposing to do with respect to thermal performance. So that's the heating and cooling load reduction expressed as TEDI. Whether the building is efficiently electrifying its space and or water heating, what kind of air infiltration reductions are proposed, things like EV readiness and whatnot are, again, those are all items that they wouldn't be able to enter into the equation of percent better that we currently have. So this is kind of reflecting more modern, up-to-date practice for how we think about building decarbonization to align better the way that we express decarbonization commitments to the way that we think about decarbonization these days. Why don't you go to the next slide? So the third and final change that we're proposing for the building GHG is to revise the emission rate that we're currently using for the electric grid emissions. So the way that analyses are done with respect to GHG comparisons is to look at the electric grid emissions of the grid that we have today. And that was, I think, okay for 14 years ago, but it's not very representative anymore, given the policies that we've now put in place for renewable inputs into our grid. So what's happening is that our electric grid is rapidly decarbonizing, and it will be a very different grid by 2050. So what we would propose to do here is to change from looking at GHG of today, the pounds per megawatt hour of grid emissions, to a GHG that we expect to have in 2050 in terms of pounds per megawatt hour of grid emissions. And that would actually be a much more representative picture of the emissions of the building in its lifetime. So that's the third and final update. Let's go to the next slide. I think we can discuss the details of the best practices. So let's go to the next slide. So the best practices are tied to building use type and size. So the best practices vary depending upon those two things. So we would start with small non-residential commercial. So any non-residential small commercial except for warehouse, restaurant, and high ventilation buildings, we would propose that the best practice is all electric pathway of the specialized, plus using option 8 of CO4/6 measure, which is somewhat lower air infiltration, as well as a commitment to use a heat pump for water heating or solar thermal water heating plus electric resistance. So that would be, again, if your building was proposing to do this, then we wouldn't require any analyses. This building would be complete its GHG from our perspective. Let's go to the next slide. So if we go to non-residential large buildings, so over 20,000 square feet, except for warehouse, restaurant, and high ventilation, it's very much the same thing as the last slide, except we introduce another limitation here, which is to introduce maximum of 50% glazed wall system in order to encourage more judicious use of glazed wall systems. Next slide, please. For high ventilation buildings, these buildings could have the option of being all electric or mixed fuel of the specialized, plus similar looking bullets as you've seen in the other slides. So the lower air infiltration, the more judicious use of glazed wall systems, and the air source heat pump for water heating. So recall in the code, though, that high ventilation buildings does have a mandatory hybrid electrification. So that kind of comes with the territory. So here you could do just that, or you could be fully electric. Either one of those would be qualifying for the opt-out. Next slide. I think did one slide get skipped? Can you go backwards? Okay, thank you. I think, okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, sorry about that. Warehouse is follow the all-electric path or the mixed fuel pathway. So it could be a combination of, it could be either all-electric or a combination of hybrid electrification with gas. So that's that first bullet, 25% peak load with air source, plus the water heating with heat pumps. And the one thing that we're introducing here for warehouses, because there's such large footprint, is R40 roof. We think that that's justified considering the very large footprint of these buildings and the fact that these buildings are good for hosting solar. So we're looking to have kind of an upgraded roof prior to solar installations on them, which would preclude upgrading the roof in the future. Next slide. For restaurants, it would be the all-electric pathway, the specialized, and the lower air infiltration and the air source heat pump water heating. Next slide. For residential, there's a few different kind of if-thens here. So if the residential is 3 stories or less, we would propose that the opt-out best practice is all-electric pathway of the specialized. And if it's less than 5 dwelling units, then the standard to meet would be HERS 40 or passive house. If it was 5 or more dwelling units, it would be passive house. That's tied to mass save incentives. That's why we make that distinction there. And then in either case, if the building is a single family type building or a townhouse type building, it would have the additional requirement of having air source heat pump water heating or the solar thermal plus electric resistance. Next slide. For large residential, it would be the all-electric pathway, the specialized code and passive house. And then the introduction here that if there's more than 50 units in a building, that justifies use of a centrally located air source heat pump for water heating. If it's less than 50 units, then that wouldn't apply. So just to reinforce again, all of these things are described in this section of the slides. These are all completely voluntary. If you take them on, then you qualify as meeting best practices, and thus can be relieved of the GHG MEPA review that you otherwise go through. And if you wish to not do some of these things in your building, that is totally acceptable. It's simply the same process that we have now. And then, of course, and to reinforce here, this is not all project in or out. This can be applied to buildings individually. So again, if you had 4 buildings on your project, one of them could do an opt-out and the other 3 could be, not doing the opt-out. So you can mix and match in that way. This is meant to be something to encourage, but not be required. I think that's the end of my deck. Tori, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Paul. It looks like we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so maybe we can stop the recording briefly and then we can go over the questions first, if that makes sense, for participating today. Okay, so we're going to move on to other aspects of the MEPA greenhouse gas emissions policy. We just addressed stationary source. So we'll be moving on to land alteration, mobile sources, and social cost of carbon. I would say these aspects are a bit more conceptual than what was presented earlier with respect to stationary source. They're reflecting some new recommendations and policy initiatives of this administration. So it's somewhat conceptual, but we still would like to take some early public feedback on these concepts. So with respect to land alteration, next slide, please. So just by way of background, these are just, I'm sorry, my phone is giving me an alert at the moment. So by way of background, these are some points related to state planning around decarbonization, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And in contrast to prior years, the state's Clean Energy and Climate Plan now very much focuses on what's referenced as natural and working lands. So to preserve the carbon storage and the carbon sequestration benefits of forest and those natural lands is definitely a key priority and a goal of state planning as we move towards our 2050 goals. So as is shown at the bottom of the slide here, there are certain goals and targets within the plan, including, for example, preserving 40% of Massachusetts lands and waters by the year 2050. So in this regard, the MEPA program has been identified and referenced in these various planning documents. So in the 2025 and 30 CECP plan, the initial reference was a recommendation that MEPA deliberate with our advisory board about the potential to add a new review threshold. So this would be a regulatory threshold related to forest clearing, and that would have the effect of bringing in new projects in for review that may not otherwise be required, and also to develop a carbon accounting methodology. So that deliberation actually occurred already a couple of years ago. That concept was presented to the MEPA Advisory Committee. We did not move forward with regulatory changes at that time. But since then, with the change in administration, there have been new recommendations. And this slide actually should say 2023. I apologize, we'll fix the typo. But the link is at the bottom here. There are some new recommendations that have come out through the climate chief, Melissa Hoffer, which now, again, recommends that MEPA consider a regulatory change that would address forest clearing. So this proposal is not a regulatory proposal. That is something that is under consideration for a possible future change. But the climate chief's report also referenced possible changes to our existing greenhouse gas policy, whereby more projects would be required and asked to assess their greenhouse gas impacts associated with land clearing. And that is what the proposal is today. And there's also a concept of a mitigation fund, but that is not yet proposed as well. Next slide. So this is by way of background, there are existing review thresholds in regulation related to land. And as many of you know, the existing rules are if the project alters 25 or more acres or the higher threshold of 50 or more acres, then the projects are required to come in for MEPA review, provided that some form of state action is needed. So again, this proposal is not seeking to change these regulatory thresholds at this time. Next slide. So the change that's proposed is just a change to policy, and in line with what was stated earlier about the climate chief's recommendations. This would just lower the acreage at which projects that are already required to undergo review would be asked to provide an analysis of their carbon impacts from land alteration. And as the language states here, it's a potentially be subject, so would not be an automatic requirement. But if right now the policy indicates that the project must clear over 50 acres to be subject to the requirement, we're proposing to just reference any MEPA review threshold. And currently that threshold is 25 acres. So, and this would be for all land cover types. So if it's a project clearing 25 acres or more, you may be asked at the Secretary's discretion to provide further analysis of the carbon impacts from that clearing. Next slide. So we're also proposing to put out some additional guidance that would give a clear directives to proponents about how to engage in this analysis. I know this area can be quite complex, so we would provide a standard methodology. We are currently contemplating use of publicly available mapping resources. There would be an option for the proponent to conduct a site-specific assessment, for example, a forest inventory, if it wishes to present lower estimates. But at this time, we do anticipate requiring a standard methodology using publicly available tools. And we would also provide some guidance around mitigation options. I think this language has already appeared in many of our MEPA certificates, but some strategies, including, of course, tree replanting or permanent land conservation being the priority, but where those are not feasible, other strategies like heat reduction strategies in overburdened areas as well. Again, we could potentially create a fund that would require legislation, or we may use existing funds. Our Department of Conservation and Recreation, for example, has an existing fund that could be used for land conservation. So we haven't, this isn't a specific proposal, but we wanted to at least get the concept of an in lieu fee mitigation out for comment to see what the reaction may be from the regulated community. And as I stated earlier, we have been asked to consider a regulatory change to add a new threshold related to forest clearing. So that is under consideration, but we are not proposing that at this time. Right, next slide. Okay, so that's really it. That one change to the policy is what's proposed with associated guidance for land. Moving on to mobile sources, next slide. Here again, just providing some background about state planning around mobile sources. So greenhouse gas emissions from traffic still remains a high source of emissions in the economy. And so there are some key targets and metrics, the primary strategy being, of course, electrification, promoting more electric vehicles, EV chargers. And so those are, those we would continue to request that those be considered. There is also a percent reduction in what's called VMT per household. That's vehicle miles traveled per household. I would call this a soft target. It's not a limit or hard metrics, but it is a statistic that we are continuing to track. So with new development, we do anticipate increases in overall vehicle miles traveled. But I think the state planning is to try to incentivize as best as possible a reduction in the per household VMT as a way to reach our greenhouse gas goals. Next slide. So the policy updates here, I'd say are fairly modest. One is just simply a technical edit to the policy. Right now, when we require a quantification of mobile source greenhouse gas emissions, we just require a percent better measure. What are your emissions with the project? If you are mitigating in some respect, how much are you reducing those emissions? However, when a traffic study is conducted, typically the starting point is existing conditions, and then you will model out future, what's called no build conditions, sort of essentially background conditions in the future year when the project is expected to be built, and then a future no build to build. So when we ask for greenhouse gas analysis, it already is coming in this fashion because typically a traffic study is conducted and then the greenhouse gas emissions are calculated from the traffic study. So this is just a technical edit to make sure that the policy aligns with existing practice. Next slide. An additional measure we are considering, and this would go out through guidance, is a potential methodology for reporting on that VMT per household metric. So this is slightly different from the VMT that's generated from the traffic study, where that is just miles traveled within the traffic study radius, typically a very small geographic area around the project site. Here, we are considering a standard methodology where there would be a reporting of the total VMT for the entire project, and then a per household measure, which would depend on the specific county that the project is proposed. So again, we're not looking to impose a big onerous site-specific study of home to work, commuting patterns, et cetera. There are some standard methodologies where one might, for example, assume a certain distance traveled per trip within the county, and then that could easily be converted into a VMT measure. So again, just it would be a simple metric that we could use to track some progress towards the CECP goals. And then we would provide some guidance around mitigation strategies. The key one here being, to put, obviously the goal is to reduce vehicular trips. So the key mitigation is often promoting those TDM measures, traffic demand mitigation measures, to encourage more use of transit and other non-vehicular modes of travel. And if the commitments are high, for example, high mode share targets, there could be some opportunities for opt-outs similar to the stationary source. And then just a note here that we're also considering some changes to our environmental justice protocols, because the more traffic is generated, there are also air quality impacts to already burdened areas. So there could be some corresponding changes in the future related to environmental justice. So again, this is more of a conceptual proposal to come out with a VMT measure. The California CEQA program, which is the counterpart to MEPA in California, already has this type of measure in place. So just looking for some general feedback about from proponents who may be aware of other states doing similar types of approaches, and the pros and cons of MEPA coming out with this as a simple tracking tool. Okay, next slide. All right, so that's it on mobile sources. The last topic here is social cost of carbon. Next slide. So here again, we're picking up on recommendations from the climate chief that was issued, and apologize again, this should say 2023. And the recommendation is simply that MEPA follow the federal guidance under federal NEPA that was issued recently from the Council of Environmental Quality to incorporate a social cost of carbon measure into environmental reviews. And social cost of carbon, of course, is just simply that when we are assessing the carbon impacts, in other words, the greenhouse gas emissions impacts of projects, what is the associated social cost that might induce? So it's more of an indirect impact measure as opposed to a direct measure of greenhouse gas emissions. So again, this is very conceptual, but the policy update would simply say that at the Secretary's discretion, a social cost of carbon analysis could be required consistent with NEPA guidance, and it would be required on a case-by-case basis. So far, we have included this language in just one project where the proposal was to expand fossil fuel energy infrastructure through new gas pipelines. So it's, so I think it's possible that energy projects may be a primary focus, but just allowing for this consideration where circumstances may warrant. And the EEA, the state through EEA did issue a particular recommendation for a specific dollar value through the Mass Save program, and the link on this slide is a link to that measure. So these values do tend to change over time, and with inflation, of course, dollar amounts increase over time. So the idea would be to reference whatever the most recent social cost calculation is that's been performed by the state, and right now that is through the Mass Save program. Okay, next slide. So here's just a schedule for potential changes. So we are now discussing this straw proposal. We'll be taking comments through September 16th. Of course, these public information sessions are happening this week. I'm also open for small group discussions, focus groups discussions upon request by specific stakeholder groups. So please feel free to be in touch if you'd like that. And then looking to put out the full text sometime in the fall with the effective date of early next year. Next slide. And these are just ways to keep involved. So the MEPA-regs@mass.gov is the email address where comments should be sent. And there is a listserv you can subscribe to receive ongoing alerts about our reg review efforts. So that's available. And the link here is our primary website link where all information related to regulatory and policy changes will be made. So, okay, so that is the end. I do have some questions here. So I think we can stop the recording at this point, but again, Okay, so again, my name's Tori Kim, the director of the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act program, or MEPA, MEPA. This is a presentation on some updates to the MEPA Climate Resiliency Policy. The full title is the Climate Change Adaptation and Resiliency Policy. We're calling this a straw proposal, which means that the full language of the policy updates is not yet available for comment. This is a conceptual proposal of some updates that we are planning, but nonetheless, we are welcoming comments by September 16th at the email address that I will present at the end of the presentation. It's also all available on our website. Next slide. So in terms of where we're going, we'll present some background here. Our colleague from the Climate Office is here to present on the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, which many of you are already familiar with. It's already in use during MEPA reviews, but Caitlin is here to provide a reminder of how the tool works. We also have currently an interim protocol in effect. We've collected some project data and trends that we've seen on the climate information that has come in since October of 2021. And then we'll present on the potential updates to the policy. And as with the greenhouse gas policy, we did have an initial discussion about many of these concepts at a May 2022 meeting of the advisory committee. The link presented here still has all of those materials that were discussed at all of the past advisory committee meetings, so all of that can be viewed on our website. Next slide. So a bit of background here. These just present the key dates when the climate issues have been incorporated through MEPA. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was added way back in 2008 that requires consideration of climate change in MEPA reviews. There was a draft climate adaptation policy issued in 2014, but never finalized. So we were successful in implementing the greenhouse gas policy component starting in 2010, but the climate adaptation portion has always lagged behind, and we were not successful in issuing a full policy at that time. And since then, there's been a lot of state planning around climate change, trying to make our entire state resilient to future climate conditions. As we know, there's increased precipitation, more intense storm events, as well as droughts and extreme heat events, such as the one we're experiencing this week. So executive orders were issued. There was a statewide hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan released. And then finally, in April of 2021, the tool, this Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, was released as a resource for any member of the public to input project information and to receive some recommendations for how to plan for 4 particular climate parameters. And Caitlin will go over that in more detail. So with the release of this tool, I think and I was around in 2021, the MEPA program felt that there was enough of a foundation to issue an interim protocol. And so far, and so that has been in effect in October in 2021. And we have essentially required all project proponents to use the new tool to assess the climate risks of the project. And then even since then, there's been even more planning. A climate change assessment was released late 2022. Another 5-year update of the so-called Resilient Mass Plan was released. And as some of you know, EEA is embarking on a companion initiative called the Resilient Coast Strategy that's undergoing a stakeholder process now as well. Next slide. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin Spence from our climate team, just to remind, so some of you may know this already, but just to remind what the main functionalities are from the tool. And again, this is already in use at MEPA, and every project proponent is required to submit an output report from this tool with their MEPA filings. So I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Thank you, Tori. I'm here today to provide an overview and reminder on the purpose and function of the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team's Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. I'm from the Office of Climate Science. The goals of the tool are to make a preliminary climate resilience analysis more broadly acceptable to those who are proposing new projects and want a sense of how to design the project for future climate change. Originally, the tool was designed to inform budgeting and capital planning on the state level and incorporate climate change vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation standards. The tool was developed to review and update design standards using Massachusetts climate change projections that will support best management practices. The tool is interactive and web-based, so it's a website that automates the application of climate change data and provides preliminary climate hazard exposure screening, meaning a sense of what natural hazards the project will be exposed to in the future, a score of the risk of the project to climate hazards, and recommendations for how to design the project for its level of exposure to hazards in the future and its criticality. The goal of designing this tool is to make the climate resilience analysis broadly accessible. So you don't have to be an expert in climate change or resilience to do design that is resilient to climate change. To provide recommendations which are based on a consistent way of using climate change data in design. And providing support to state agencies that can use and administer grant programs. We encourage the use of the tool for projects which have physical assets to understand things like, to what extent is the project exposed to extreme heat, extreme rainfall, river flooding, and coastal flooding? How sensitive the project is to hazards it's exposed to? What design criteria or projected hazard metrics should the project incorporate based on overall risk at the end of its useful life? So something that is will last longer will be designed or recommended to use projections from further ahead. The project can be accessed using multiple links on the Resilient Mass homepage. Users can log in or register for an account by clicking on the blue button on the tool landing page. This is highlighted on the lower right side of this slide. It's pretty easy to set up an account. Next slide. It's best to use this tool at the beginning of a project. So when you are planning the project in early design and procurement. It's also helpful to use this tool when citing a project and when looking to improve a state grant application by providing a unified and consistent screening of the proposal for climate hazards. Next slide. Key available resources. In addition to providing the tool itself, we provide a number of resources on how to use the tool and best practices for using the tool. There is a user guide. There are training videos with timestamps so that you can skip to key sections of the video. There is a guidance and best practices document with information to consider site suitability, regional coordination, and flexible climate adaptation pathways in the design of the project. And there are documentation documents and training for technical data inputs to the tool for those who want to understand how it works on a deeper level. I would encourage anyone who is using the tool and feels confused by a question that the tool is asking to check out especially the user guide and the guidance and best practices document, which have a lot of suggestions on how to use the tool and answer some of the questions. Next slide. So I mentioned that first-time users will need to create an account as shown in the image on the right. External users who are not part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts state government will follow a register wizard system, which will help them set up an account. State users who work for the state of Massachusetts should request access by sending an email to the email address rmat@mass.gov. This may take a few days, so please try to register state users a few days ahead of when you will need to use the tool. Once you're able to log into the tool, you will be able to search for existing projects using the search button on the right in blue, or create a new project by clicking on the green button, which is shown on the bottom right corner of the screen. Next slide. The tool will guide users through creating the new project. The first step is to draw a shape around the location where a proposed project will take place. The drawing tools will appear in the map in the upper right of the window. And to draw the shape, click at key points in the boundary of the shape and double click to finish. When done drawing the shape, click the save icon. Next slide. The tool will then ask the user for information about what they are proposing at the location they just outlined. This information, it comes in 4 different steps or categories. One category is core project information, about what it is. Step 2 is about how the project provides ecosystem services. So benefits to the ecosystem and benefits that ecosystems provide beyond being an ecosystem. Step 3 asks about um, exposure to climate hazards at the location. So things like storm surge, flooding, extreme heat, and what the user knows about them already. And step 4 asks the user to enter specific pieces which are being proposed as part of the project. Next slide. So to show a little more detail about what these steps ask, the left side of the slide shows the project ecosystem services benefits, which ask many questions about what the project provides. So things like, does the project provide flood protection through green stormwater infrastructure or nature-based infrastructure? Does the project provide protection from storm damage? Does the project replenish water supply, etc. So there are many different ways the project can provide ecosystem services, and the user can answer yes to those which the project will provide and no to those which it probably will not provide. On the right, we see how the user can enter project climate exposure, which again is about what the user knows about the hazards that have occurred at the project site in the past. And in step 4, entering asset-specific information. So if the project will build, for example, a building, the user would enter that as a specific asset and answer some questions about the asset. If the project also involved a rain garden, the user would enter that as a separate asset and answer questions about that. Assets each have a category. The categories are building facility, infrastructure, or natural resources. And within each of these categories, assets have types and subtypes to get more specific about what the project is proposing and how each type of thing interacts with climate change hazards. The questions related to each asset will address how critical the asset is, how sensitive it is to different natural hazards, and what the consequences are if the asset is damaged by climate change hazards. Next slide. When users have completed all the project inputs in each of those 4 steps, the tool will provide a project output report, both in a web page and in a downloadable report. So the user will immediately be able to preview the project score in terms of environmental justice, ecosystem service benefits, and exposure and risk related to climate change hazards. And the slide shows a preview of what the collapsed version of that output looks like. Next slide.
Caitlin, I'm sorry to apologize. We're getting some background noise, I think from the Vietnamese interpreter. Perhaps the person could mute or may not be in the right channel. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Right. Yes. So the climate exposure score will score whether the project has low, moderate, or high exposure to sea level rise and storm surge. In this example, the exposure is high. Whether the project is exposed, moderately exposed, or highly exposed to extreme precipitation, riverine flooding, um, extreme precipitation, urban or stormwater flooding. In this case, the project is moderately exposed, and whether the project is exposed moderately or highly exposed to extreme heat. The tool will evaluate where the project is and compare the location to data sets on things like coastal floodplains, projected extreme precipitation, projected extreme heat, um, and other factors, as well as the information the user provided in the project input section to generate these exposure scores. The little question mark next to the circle with the exposure rating will provide more information on why the project received the exposure score that it did. Next slide. So the exposure score relates to the overall project. Each asset entered in the inputs section will also receive a preliminary climate risk rating. So you see similar little bars at the bottom of this screen for sea level rise and storm surge, extreme precipitation, urban or stormwater flooding, and extreme precipitation, riverine flooding, as well as extreme heat. And in this case, the risk rating for riverine flooding, to which the project as a whole was rated not exposed, is rated as low risk. However, this particular asset was rated as high risk for storm surge and extreme heat, and moderate risk for stormwater flooding. So as noted at the bottom of this slide, it is possible to get not exposed as a rating for a particular project, such as this example for riverine flooding, but still get an asset risk score. The risk score will simply be low. Next slide. So in addition to a general overall risk rating for each asset, under each asset and each type of climate hazard, so in this case, the slide is showing sea level rise and storm surge, the tool will provide detailed information on the preliminary recommended design standards for that asset. So in this case, we're clicking on the sea level rise storm surge tab to see that output. There's also an extreme precipitation tab and an extreme heat tab. The first tab under sea level rise and storm surge provides the recommended design standards. At the top of these design standards is a target planning horizon. In this case, the recommendation is to plan for the projected sea level rise and storm surge conditions of 2070 with an intermediate planning horizon of 2050. This is provided as a recommendation because there is uncertainty about the path of future sea level rise, and it may be advisable to design for an intermediate period with flexibility incorporated to allow to adjust the design for more extreme future conditions if necessary. The design standards also recommend a return period of a 50-year coastal storm return period or a 2% annual chance of flooding event. Each of these boxes below under design criteria applicable for, in this case, the pump station asset, provide that things like the tidal datums, water surface elevation, wave action water elevation, and others. These information come from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, which is a large data product that we provide for coastal flood information. And if you expand each of these little parameters, the user will see actual design elevations or preliminary design elevations for which the pump station should be designed. Next slide. So this slide shows an example of what it looks like when one of these parameters is expanded. So you see there is a table with an explanation of what is shown in the table. So what does water surface elevation mean? And it shows specific elevations for 2050 and 2070 at the recommended storm frequency, which is the 50-year storm. Below this expanded output is guidance on how to use this particular parameter of water surface elevation in early planning, early design, when evaluating the project, and also an explanation of the limitations of using these projected water surface elevation values. Next slide. The second tab, second and third tabs under sea level rise and storm surge provide maps showing the elevation of in this case, the 2050 500-year return period flood at a different project location. These maps are useful because they allow users to see which parts of the project site will be exposed to the deepest flooding for particular coastal storm types of interest. And additional maps will be built into the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool in an update to be released this coming summer. Next slide. Similar to the tool's output for storm surge and sea level rise, the tool will also provide recommendations for extreme precipitation design parameters. In this case, in this example, the target planning horizon for this particular asset is, I'm having trouble reading it actually. I think it's 2050. And a 2050 100-year or 1% annual chance precipitation amount. The table below shows the asset, the recommended target decade for the projection, and the actual depth of a 24-hour 100-year precipitation event in 2050 of 9.9 inches in this case. And similar to the sea level rise and coastal storm output, the tool provides guidance on how to use this in planning, early design, evaluation, as well as some limitations. Next slide. Great. For extreme heat, similarly, the tool now provides tables with design parameters for extreme heat. In this example, showing projected annual average temperature, summer and winter average temperature as well. Similar to the other climate hazards, the tool provides an extreme heat target planning horizon and percentile. In this case, the percentile is the percentile projected extreme heat metric change from an ensemble of climate model projections, meaning looking at what multiple climate models say about the future and then taking either the 50th percentile, so the projection for which half of climate models say more change in extreme heat, and half of climate models say less change in extreme heat. If assets are more critical, the percentile recommendation may be higher. Next slide. So after viewing the project output, the user can view a report which will summarize the same information shown on the project output page. So a summary showing the full project site exposure scores as well as the asset risk ratings, which can be viewed in detail in the project output page. It's possible to download a PDF of the report and save it for future reference or for things like attaching to a grant or permit application. And when the user is confident they don't want to make any more changes to the project, they can click Submit and have it become part of the database. And so the downloaded PDF should be attached to the respective grant portal or to the MEPA filing. If the project is in the conceptualization phase, it is totally fine to spend some time working on the report before clicking submit and making sure you're confident in all project inputs, for example. You can download a report without submitting the project. Next slide. So this slide shows how to submit the project, which is the last step. It is a simple page with a blue button that says Submit Project. Once you click Submit, you will not be able to edit your project information anymore. Next slide. The tool has gone through several versions. I am not going to go over all the details in every version. However, several past slides have noted changes that are upcoming this summer. Currently in progress are updates to the temperature design standards by adding actual projection metrics into the tool interface and adding new maps showing the Massachusetts coastal flood risk model data sets. So projected wave action water elevation. Several bug fixes will also be incorporated into this version release. Next slide. In addition to showing how the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool works, we want to show where you can find some of the information that is presented on the tool. So I showed earlier the 2050 100-year storm for a particular project location. You can look at a full range of precipitation durations and return periods for multiple future decades on the climate projections and hazards viewer. This provides multiple projected future metrics, some of which are also pulled into the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. Here we've highlighted the precipitation frequency table and shown some information on how to find particular design values of interest. Next slide. I also wanted to highlight some training and background on the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model datasets, which are pulled into the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. We have 3 training videos on understanding the dataset on YouTube. You can download the data for analysis from the Woods Hole Group website. The Woods Hole Group produced the data set. And you can also if you don't want to actually download the data, simply explore visually on 3 different data viewers, which are shown at the bottom of the website. Next slide. And that's it. Please reach out to rmat@mass.gov with any questions. This is the email address that fields any issues with the tool. Note that there are no full-time staff whose entire working time is dedicated to answering this emails to this address. So please expect a response within 3 to 5 business days to resolve issues. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. Why don't we stop the recording just for 1 minute and then. All right, so we just went through an explanation of the climate resilience design tool from a member of our climate team. So I'm moving on to present some project data that we've collected since October of 2021, when the tool output was first required as an attachment to the project notification form, the so-called ENF form. I'll go through this pretty quickly because I know we want to get to the actual policy updates. Next slide. So the 2021 interim protocol, as I indicated earlier, the principal component was essentially to attach the output report from that design tool as part of the ENF form. At that time, we said the proponents were encouraged but not required to utilize design recommendations or the so-called tier methodologies. And we indicated in the protocol that we were primarily looking to gather data as a way to prepare for future policy updates. So we feel like we're at the point where we can move forward with some additional updates, and that is the purpose for today. Next slide. So overview of the projects that we've looked at. This was a requirement that was applied to new project filings effective October of 2021. So we've received about 362 new project filings. 96 of those exceed what we call the mandatory EIR thresholds. So all of those projects have attached that output report, and I think we've gotten very good compliance with that requirement, and it has worked fairly well. We have not received any major complaints or feedback that the output report is hard to retrieve or that the tool is hard to use. So far, we think the reaction has been favorable, and the compliance with that requirement has been quite good. Next slide. And these are the main building project types that we receive. As Caitlin mentioned, the tool categorizes the assets involved in the project into these 3 categories. And so many of the project types fit within the categories. Our top category always being real estate development, but we also look at a lot of energy, infrastructure, coastal structures, transportation, flood control, etc. Next slide. So this is an overview of the kind of exposure ratings. So this is at the project level, not for a specific asset, but based on the location of the project, what is the tool saying in terms of climate risk? So all of the red bars here pertain to high risk rating that is returned from the tool. And then we've categorized it into FEMA zones. So V zone at the top are the coastal areas. A zone are the 100-year floodplain. X zone are all areas outside the 100-year floodplain. So for the coastal areas, no surprises there. As you see in the left bar, almost all of those projects, 64 projects, 62 of them came back high risk for sea level rise. So I think that's not a big surprise. Now, the tool does incorporate data, future-oriented data. So this is projecting out during the useful life of the project. The tool is saying there is a high risk for sea level rise, storm surge in these coastal areas. In the A zone chart, again, not a big surprise. The high risk bars in the middle two columns, those pertain to extreme precipitation, both urban flooding as well as riverine flooding, which is flooding next to rivers. That category is sort of overlapping. It's not a distinct category in terms of the two types of extreme precipitation, but 161 projects in the A zone and about 125, 113 are rated high risk for extreme precipitation. So again, not a surprise. These are currently in the 100-year floodplain. I think what was somewhat surprising to us was the X zone, the gray box. 133 projects were well outside the 100-year floodplain, sometimes even outside the 500-year floodplain. And about half of those, 53, were rated high risk for riverine flooding, and 100, almost all of them, were rated high for urban flooding. So I think this reiterates what, at least I've read in press reports, what seems to be common knowledge now, that even in areas outside the floodplain, in terms of future risk to climate change, we are seeing a higher risk of extreme precipitation over time. The red bars on the right-hand side in extreme heat are also quite high, except for the coastal areas. Almost all of our projects are coming in the inland areas rated high risk for extreme heat, again, during the useful life of the project. Next slide. And then this is some data around environmental justice. About 224 out of the new projects were around environmental justice areas. And most of those were rated high for urban flooding and riverine flooding, which I think, again, is not a big surprise given that many of these areas are in urban settings, and extreme heat as well. Next slide. So key observations, as I just indicated, many projects outside the 100-year floodplain are still ranked high risk. So I think this reiterates the need to look at future climate conditions and try to plan for future conditions. And as I said, I think MEPA in many ways is a good forum to ask proponents to consider project alternatives at a higher level as you're citing projects in potentially, risky areas from a climate perspective. In terms of the asset risk ratings, those are the risk ratings for the specific assets that are proposed. They are somewhat variable, but I think what we've learned is that the climate tool was designed to provide variable results based on how critical the asset is assessed by the user. However, we have seen instances based on our experience that there are some uses like, an emergency response ambulance facility that somehow seems to have a relatively low risk rating due to the user inputs in terms of how critical the user is assessing that asset. So that is something that is sometimes concerning, and I think something that we'd like to address during MEPA through some best practices, as I'll explain in a bit. And then very few filings present quantitative analysis to assess climate resiliency, such as H&H modeling to show flooding risk. Next slide. Okay, so what are we proposing in terms of updates? This is a straw proposal, as I've indicated, but next slide, please. All right, so potential updates here. This is in terms of basic filing requirements. We do not intend to change the current requirement to attach that output report from the tool. As I said, we think we've gotten good compliance. They've come in a pretty standardized fashion, which is the whole point of the tool. So we do intend to continue with that. We're also planning some changes to the ENF form itself to promote some standard reporting of some of these key values. So we're not asking for much more here beyond just looking at the actual output report and inserting some of the key values like the exposure score into the ENF form itself so that the disclosures are a little bit more standardized and clear. Because sometimes the values can be a little hard to find in the output report. So we thought it would be helpful to just put them into the ENF form itself. There is a climate section currently in the ENF form that would be revised for this purpose. In addition to adding things like the FEMA flood zone, just to get an immediate sense of, are you in the floodplain? You know, where is the project being sited? And if there is a base flood elevation established, to report that directly in the ENF form. So this would be applicable to every single project coming in with their initial project filing. And then the last two bullets here, this is currently in the ENF form, a narrative discussion of just generally how the project is intending to incorporate resiliency measures and whether it's anticipated to be consistent with the recommendations from the tool. Next slide. So moving on, I think this number one bullet is really the high level update here. So in addition to just simply requiring the output report to be attached, what we're asking for now is, you know, not only transpose the values into the ENF form, but when you're then moving on to the EIR stage, you need to then assess whether you're being consistent with those recommendations. And I'll get into more detail about what that means. So here, as we've just heard from the 30-minute presentation about the tool, it's a fairly powerful resource. There's specific numeric values that the tool will provide directly. And so I think what we would ask for is a consultation, a consideration of these values as a first step. And then also the option of conducting more site-specific methodology, if appropriate, to demonstrate the use of best available data. And then if the project is not anticipated to meet those recommendations, then an explanation of alternative designs, flexible adaptation strategies, and the like. And then the last point here, this gets to that issue of criticality and the variable results we've received in terms of how critical the asset is assessed by the user. So the way we intend to address that is to put out in the policy itself some best practices. And this comes directly out of some of those guidance documents that's available through the tool itself. For instance, the guidance says for most so-called long-lived structures, you should be planning for at least a 40 to 60 year useful life. But we are seeing in some cases, for instance, a brand new residential structure and the user has assessed it to be planning for a 2030 planning horizon, which we think is too short. So the idea here is to put out some best practices as you're filling out that tool and putting in the project inputs, just keeping in mind these best practices in assessing the criticality and the climate risk of the tool. Next slide. So where would this new analysis be applied? So consistent with other policies, we would be saying this would be applicable to EIR, so the projects that are undergoing the environmental impact review report process and not at the ENF stage. So if you are required to undergo EIR, now more of our projects are EIRs, I will acknowledge, due to the EJ proximity requirement. So all projects in these areas, 1 or 5 miles, do have to undergo EIR. And then there are some discretionary EIRs required as well. We also intend to include reference in the NPC form, given the rapidity, with the rapidness with which climate data changes and climate conditions change. We think it's also appropriate for notices of project change to include the climate output report as well. As a practical matter, we do require that anyway, especially if it's a project that's, a phase that's happening at a later phase of a master plan. We do require that anyway. And then if the climate tool is showing that a particular climate parameter is the project is not exposed, that there would be an exception that you don't have to provide analysis in that instance. Next slide. So moving on to what exactly would be required by way of analysis, I think that the concept here is that we would put out in the policy some minimum requirements for analysis. I think assessing the climate risk of a project sometimes can be fairly general, and we are getting non-quantitative sort of narrative descriptions. And as the idea is, because the tool is giving very specific values, there is an opportunity here for the EIR to provide some very specific analysis based on the values that are being provided by the tool. So there are three main areas: elevation of structures, stormwater sizing, and extreme heat, that we would emphasize. So in terms of elevating structures, so this would apply if you're proposing a new or substantial improvement to a building or facility or infrastructure. So this is a very broad category. So any new buildings, transportation assets, energy infrastructure. If you're proposing new structures or substantially improving them, then we would ask you to consult some of the values that are available through the tool. So for sea level rise, as Caitlin was showing earlier, there are specific values related to water surface elevation or the wave action water elevation. Those are two separate values that we would ask be considered. And then if there is an established base flood elevation and that elevation is higher, we would ask you to consult that as well. So we're not asking for new, site-specific modeling to establish a BFE or a design flood elevation. We're saying the tool is providing these recommended elevations. Please consult them and report back in your EIR of how high your structure is being built relative to those recommended levels. Now, for extreme precipitation and particularly riverine flooding, the tool is not providing specific elevations. So here, what we intend to propose is if there is an established BFE, so if you're already in the 100-year floodplain and there is an established BFE, we would ask you to obviously consider that and whether you're elevating above that. If you're in an unnumbered A zone, there are floodplain areas without BFE determined. I think we would ask for the proponent to do some additional work here to determine what that elevation is. So here we are still talking about the current floodplain. As I said, many projects are being rated high risk even for future conditions, but at minimum, if you're in a 100-year floodplain, I think the idea is that we would ask for some determination of the base flood elevation based on existing methodologies. And then there's always the option for the proponent to voluntarily provide a site-specific analysis to do analysis of a proposed design flood elevation as well that takes into account future conditions. And then if the project will not meet the recommendation, there is not likely to meet those recommended elevations that provide a justification. Okay, and then next in terms of stormwater sizing, there are many projects that propose improvements or new stormwater systems. So here, again, the tool does provide specific values for that 24-hour rainfall depth associated with a future storm event. So it's doing a lot of the work already. And if you've done a basic stormwater assessment to assess the resiliency of that system, it should be fairly straightforward to compare it against the value provided by the tool. And then again, if the project will not meet that recommendation, to provide a justification. Next slide. All right, and then the last area here is extreme heat. Right now was shown earlier, most of our projects are coming in rated high for heat conditions, but we're not getting a consistent reporting about measures that the project will take. So here, I think we would ask for some standard reporting of, for instance, the increase in number of days over 90 degrees. So I think as Caitlin mentioned earlier, there's some additional values that will be available through the tool. So we wouldn't ask for much more beyond reporting back on what the tool will provide, and then a discussion of ways that the project will reduce the heat risks. The last bullet here is also we're looking at some additional measures. The tool output provides some information on the existing conditions. For example, if existing conditions are over 50% impervious or under 40% tree cover. So for those projects that appear to already, based on existing conditions, have some elevated risk, we would ask for some additional consideration of mitigation for things like tree removal or the additional impervious area. And we are doing some thinking on providing some guidance on some best practices around heat reduction strategies. So tree planting and pervious surfaces, those are obviously best practices, but providing a little additional guidance and some a more standardized reporting about what the project is actually doing to reduce heat risks. Now, for natural resource projects, these are projects that are just maintaining natural resources or sometimes removing assets. In the case of dam removals, we would just ask for a narrative discussion of the standard recommendations that are provided from the tool. And then, as some of you know, there are some other potential analyses that we have already required on a case-by-case basis, on and off-site flood impacts being a key example, the sizing of culverts in coastal erosion. So we're not intending to standardize or require this form of analysis for every single project, but on a case-by-case basis, that would be required through scoping as well. Next slide. Okay, so those are the main updates. This is a potential schedule. It's similar to the greenhouse gas policy. We're looking for comments through September 16th, and then hoping to put out the full text later in the fall. And then next slide. And the comments should come into this MEPA-regs at mass.gov, again, by September 16th. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your patience in sitting through the entire presentation. I think the highlights on the climate resiliency policy, again, is we will continue to use the climate resilience tool because there are values that are directly provided by the tool. We're asking for consideration of those values and generally addressing whether the project is consistent or not consistent with those recommendations. As some of you know, we've already incorporated some of this language into our scoping documents, so I don't think we're not anticipating doing much more than what's already in practice and using publicly available information and values through the tool. So we don't foresee this being a huge increase in workload or burden on the regulated community, but it is an important topic and in light of the increasing climate risk. So we think it is important to finally formalize a climate policy after many years, and we think it's many years overdue for MEPA to adopt this as a formal policy. Okay, so that's at the end. I'm not seeing any. Oh, there is one more question, which says the deck says